welcome to Will It Pass? This is the kind of the second installment of doing just kind of a live demo of accessibility auditing for GitLab components. I'm Jeremy Elder. I'm a senior product designer on the UX Foundations team at GitLab. And with me is Nick, if you want to give an intro.
Hi, I'm Nick Post. I'm a senior product designer in the Manage Optimize team.
Awesome. So Nick's joining me today because we thought it would be educational and more interesting to make this a conversation about accessibility auditing and how we are working through this as we take a look at components in GitLab. So we'll jump right in. The goal is to really just audit a component, take a look at some different utilities and methods to do that, report back those findings, and then offline we'll go back and add in what are potential solutions, how might we do this, we'll create additional merge requests, etc., so that we can get our components working as intended. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so Nick, give me a little nod if you can see that, or make sure we're good. All right, thanks. All right, so where this is starting is we have an epic for pajamas components, just accessibility audits. And so all of our components that exist in GitLab UI today are slated to have an audit set. And then in pajamas, we have a table that has an accessibility section, and these are marked as upcoming. What we hope to do is work through those and actually have those as complete and have the results documented in both pajamas documentation and potentially GitLab UI, etc., and also obviously issues MRs for posterity so that we can have historical record of when the audits were performed, how they were performed, so that should future issues arise, we can go back and evaluate and continue to make enhancements. So out of that, there is an issue for accessibility audit for accordions. We've broken down each of these issues to have essentially the purpose behind it, the methods and tools that will be used to evaluate the audit criteria, what to expect. There's a section for results. So when this is complete, we'll post a link to the video recording of this, list out any problem solutions, and then related MRs, and work through in typical issue fashion and MR fashion to satisfy that. So the purpose of this, just really quick, is just to make sure that these update, kind of like I mentioned, are updated and align with accessibility best practices and are usable in a variety of screen readers and modalities, mouse, touch, keyboard, etc. Making sure we have parity between experiences for users of those different input types. And in this particular audit, the methods and tools, there's more listed under the parent epic, but today I'll be walking through just testing Accordion examples in GitLab UI. I'm on macOS Big Sur using Safari with VoiceOver. That's a really good pair on the Mac side for screen reader and browser. I might jump into Chrome if I need to inspect anything in the DOM. That's my normal browser, and so I'm a little more familiar with the tools. And then potentially jump into VirtualBox with Windows 10 and use a pairing of Firefox with the NVDA screen reader. So audit criteria here is just to go through the list and kind of list out what's expected. So a little background here, I have a little bit of experience, or maybe a lot of experience, auditing components and doing accessibility audits. And so this is just a kind of a high-level bullet list of things that you would expect as you work through this particular component, in this case, the accordion. And I'll walk through those, and then we'll go through them one-on-one, or one-to-one. But first, just for accordion in particular, following the way ARIA authoring practices, looking at semantics, looking at how the accordion is triggered, the communication of statefulness, so accordion expanded, collapsed, focus order, visual design, and parity and experiences. So once again, I'll get into those. But Nick, I do want to ask you, do you have any experience performing accessibility audits, or what is your experience just in regards to accessibility in general?
None whatsoever. So if you speak simply, hopefully I'll be able to understand. But yeah, I sort of know why accessibility is important, but I don't necessarily know how to check and know whether or not a component is accessible or not. So it'd be, yeah, really useful to understand that over the course of this audit.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful, and definitely jump in if anything is unclear or could use some additional definition. And you bring up a great point about the purpose of accessibility, and really that is just to make sure that everything that we do on the web is something that users can contribute to and consume. So there's kind of um, a two-way functionality there, and we want users, regardless of input type, whether that's mouse, touch, you know, a a toggle, or any kind of an implement that maybe a braille keyboard, or implement that mimics keyboard functionality. So like a puff and sip device, or a single toggle, or switch. We want anybody who's working with GitLab to be able to use their own input preferences and capabilities to be able to contribute to GitLab, but also to consume the content within GitLab. And so part of that is just ensuring that our foundational components have those capabilities baked in. Obviously, there's time when those components are in a full page layout and other things may become factors, but at least when we start at the root of how a component's created, we set it up for more success. So that's what we want to do.
Mm. So just a question, like
Yes.
what what are the accessibility standards across sort of our market in general? Are DevOps tools typically quite accessible? Is this much of a consideration across other tools, or is this quite unique for us?
That's a great question. I don't think it's unique in the sense that any tool that serves, I guess, any number of users should be accessible. We align to and strive to satisfy WCAG 2.1 at a double A level, and I can follow up with some links to those resources. But I don't think it's different in the industry. I think what you will find is that some features are very accessible and others are not. So
Hmm.
the reasons for that vary quite a bit. However, I would expect that it is something that is very much considered and worked on. Anyone who's wanting to do educational, government contracts should to seek to have an accessible product, because many of those contracts will have an addendum or requirements that say it must pass a certain level of accessibility, whether that's Section 508 or the OADA in Canada, or just whatever it might be globally. There's going to be some requirements that go along with that, and so I think it's definitely expected. I don't think we're unique in that. And to be quite honest, I don't think we're unique in how we're approaching this and auditing. I've seen other teams do that quite a bit, and I think it's part of a healthy development ecosystem. And so,
Cool, good to know.
yeah. All right. So jumping right in with the accordion, I just wanted to provide a little definition for the accordion and its purpose as a UI component, just so we can have context there. Accordions are used to just group similar content and hide and show it depending on a user's needs. So it's kind of a progressive disclosure, if you will. It's a way to essentially condense a UI and have content available when a user wants to see it, rather than providing it all at once. This can be used to group information, to keep content succinct, and so that's kind of the purpose behind it. Just by way of the name, accordion, it kind of infers more than one, so typically used as a set. However, there is what I would consider just a collapse component, where there might be a single instance that is expanded and collapsed. I won't go too much into that today, although we do use that in GitLab UI. It's not officially blocked out as a component. I think today our accordion can be used as a one or many, but I'll focus on this mainly as we have it in GitLab UI, set up as an accordion. and our examples of it, as I said. So I'll jump into, oh, well, you know
And
what, and I should,
just as a
yeah.
question, why would we start with doing accessibility audits? Audits. Why would we start with doing accessibility audits at the component level as opposed to say the page or the feature level, something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at a component level, you're able to test this item in isolation. And since many of these components have somewhat nuanced behavior or functionality, you're able to test that essentially in a vacuum and make sure that works. When you start getting to the page level, you can, noise isn't the right term, right? But there's so many other things that can come into play. And so, for example, anything from page layout to color and contrast to things that might not even have to do with that individual component. I think it's very helpful to start at a component level and obviously do those fuller audits, but really start kind of even thinking along the lines of atomic design, start at that one unit and make sure that as you build that out, it's semantic, its design is appropriate, the function is appropriate, it delivers on the intent. And then as we start to ramp up and build out more patterns or layouts where that component is used, and we start to surround it with other items, then we can start to take that into account in those ways. And so I find that starting here is very helpful, and it always gives us a place to point back to if we need to kind of trace back the accessibility of an item.
Cool, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So demo, I should have done this earlier, but just clicking through expand collapse, you can see in this one, they can be expanded, collapsed independently. There's a slight animation. There's a caret that indicates some interactivity as well as a bit of a link affordance. When that clicks, the caret rotates, like a chevron, if you will. In GitLab UI itself, there is an additional example where you can click on one and only have one exposed at a time. Excuse me. So we'll take a look at that as well. But go back over to the issue here. So I'm going to start with the what to expect, and this is typically how when I approach an accessibility audit, that's what I like to look at. I do some research on what are the expectations, how should this be authored, what is the behavior, and then from there you can understand how this should be working with keyboarding and other inputs, and what kind of attributes might need to be about that, and from there you understand or research, okay, how do different screen readers handle this, how does JAWS versus NVDA versus VoiceOver handle some of these maybe ARIA attributes, and start to look into making it more universal and understanding what you might expect as a test result. So an accordion, and this is a good one to start with because it's rather simple. It's essentially a pair of an accordion header and an accordion panel, right? So you have a trigger object and you have the content object, and it's just a relationship between those two. And so if we take a look at it that way, it's pretty simple. It's got a simple behavior, some CSS, some JavaScript to make it work, and so wrapped up in that, it's a pretty tight package to start with initially. So from an accordion standpoint, I know I have a bulleted list here of some items that I'm taking a look at. The first is that it follows the way our ARIA authoring practices for an accordion. And so we'll just jump over to see what that looks like. When you excuse me, when you work with ARIA, which is accessible rich internet applications, we can just go up to the introduction here. These guides are practices to help how to understand how to use ARIA to make sure that that browsers, screen readers can understand what is supposed to happen. It kind of adds a layer to HTML so that we can have additional meaning inferred and added, and then the browser can use that to essentially know what to do. So when we're looking at the accordion section here, it provides a few definitions that we've already walked through. There's the accordion header, accordion panel. They do provide an example. And then one of the areas I really key in on is the keyboard interaction. So how should this behave? What should the expected behavior be? Typically as you're navigating a website, you might use the tab key to move focus from one element to the next. But when you get into different components, there are different keyboard interactions that should come with that, and that many times in JavaScript have to be tied to that functionality. So for an accordion example, you need to have enter or space key that triggers it, the expansion and the collapsing. Tab key, which moves focus from the next visible element, or the next focusable element, sorry. And when an accordion panel is expanded, tab should be able to move to any focusable content within that panel and then continue traversing the page. Shift tab just moves focus to the previous element. And then there's a few optional items in here. Down arrow to move from one accordion item to the next, up to do the opposite direction, home to go to the first, end to go to the end. Those are all optional. And as I was looking at our implementation, we haven't implemented any of those optional keyboard interactions. And so I won't be worried about adjusting any of those at this point in time. Adding those can help keyboard users just to be able to, to traverse that quicker. But they are optional.
So are there other standards apart from ARIA that we could be following, or is our ARIA like the gold standard that everyone goes for?
I think ARIA would be the authoring practices that you'd want to stick with when building something like this. So if we were evaluating color contrast or other attributes, we might be looking more at like the WCAG documentation, and some of that I'll get into. I'll maybe run a scan or two and just see if anything comes up. But in this one in particular, we're focused more on the functionality, just because it's made of simple elements. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and actually, to your point there, with WCAG, we'll look at the affordance of the accordion just to make sure that it infers that it's clickable and stands out as something that's interactive. So this is a bit verbose, but I'll skim through this because it is something that, as I was going through this, I would read and work through. So the title of each accordion header is contained within an element with a row of button that can be an actual button itself, and in which case you don't need to add the additional role. Or if something is, if you're using a span or a div, you would want to have role button on there so that it actually gains the keyboard functionality that a button would, to have kind of the events tied to it. Each accordion header button is wrapped in an element with a role heading. And that is set for ARIA level that's appropriate. So for example, you might have an H3 with a nested button, and that nested button is what triggers the panel. There's some additional information about using ARIA level. Won't go into that too much right now, but that might come up in some of our suggestions based on what I've seen in just kind of initial run through. The accordion panel associated should have, if it's visible, it should have ARIA expanded set to true. And if it's hidden, ARIA expanded is set to false. The ARIA expanded and ARIA collapse, or I'm sorry, ARIA expanded true or false is on that button element, not the actual content. And the reason for that is because if it was expanded, you'd be able to find, okay, it's expanded, but if it's collapsed, you're not going to have any idea to know that, because it would likely be hidden and you'd never be able to find it to even see that. So the ARIA expanded attribute is added to that button element. The accordion header button should have ARIA controls set to the ID containing the panel content. That's just another way to tie it together. In a little bit of research, it does seem like ARIA controls doesn't have a lot of screen reader support. I think JAWS supports it the most. And so because of that, Some have said, hey, it's not necessary. According to this, you can still include that, but I haven't seen a negative impact of not having it. However, it's probably a good idea just to include it, but know that the support level is probably going to be low for it. If the accordion panel associated with it is visible, and it can't be collapsed, the button has to have ARIA disabled set to true. So that accordion always has to be open. Then there has to be a way to make sure that you can't close it. We won't have to cover that in ours because all of ours are optionally toggled. And then as an option, each element that is the container for the panel content can have a role of a region and ARIA label by to help describe it a little further. So a lot there, and I know that there's maybe some background knowledge around ARIA and how that works, but we could maybe cover that a little differently. But any thoughts, comments, questions to this point, Nick?
Nothing so far. No.
Okay. Yeah, I know that's that's a lot, and that covers a lot of really what the additional what to expect is, right? So correct semantics, and the reason for this too is, and obviously that mentions semantics, but we want the document structure to make sense and accessible without JavaScript or CSS applied. If we took those things away, having correct semantics means that content is still going to be accessible. If we're using kind of incorrect things, there'll be some problems in understanding that content. Here again, space or enter triggers the accordion. We mentioned that. Communication of the states, we mentioned that as well. Focus order was mentioned. Now, visual design and text affordance, this item here, that's something that we haven't covered. That would be more under the kind of the WCAG criteria that would say, hey, this needs to look and have the affordance to indicate that it is actionable, and the statefulness of it, and helps indicate what is changing. And then lastly, ensuring parity in experience between sighted and non-sighted users. So another way to put that would be that, okay, if an accordion's collapsed and content is hidden for one type of user, a sighted user, it should also be hidden for a non-sighted user, and that creates parity, right? So you're not going to make a sighted user traverse all that content when it's hidden. Don't do that to a screen reader user in the same way. So we want to have parity between both experiences. So we're going to take a look at that. So a lot said there. So initially, what I'll do with an audit, a lot of times I'll take a look at the design. If it's available, I'll just say, okay, what was the design intent? Okay, I understand. Here's a collapse state. Here's an expanded state. I see some indentation. I see, a change in the chevron state there. And so because of that, I'm able to kind of have an inference of the behavior and what's supposed to be happening. And I'll hop into GitLab UI typically. The reason for that is in Pajamas, these are kind of nested demos. I could jump over to GitLab UI where the component is, and actually these are in Storybook, which I find a bit problematic for testing because of its nested iframes. So I will pop that content out of its iframe if I can, and give it a test there. I'll jump there in a minute, but I'll take a look at it in GitLab UI and just see, okay, is it working as I expected? I can see that, okay, it's expanding, it's collapsing. So I know functionally the behavior is there. If I tab through here, I can see that I can focus on those items. I'm using the space, or I'm sorry, the enter key to expand and collapse, using the space bar to expand and collapse. So I'm just kind of giving it a run through and testing out a few of these items that I've uncovered from the authoring practices, testing it out. Oftentimes I'll run a few scans. You can see in Storybook here, we do have this accessibility tab with 14 passes. This goes through that some checks that can be done automated. So the ARIA attributes are allowed for the role. It's that there's appropriate values. So all of these are passing. So no red flags initially, right? I'll jump over here into, actually, I'm gonna jump over to Chrome for this one because I have the tools. in here. I'll just see if I can pop this out of its. Yeah, Chrome doesn't like doing that in here. So what I'm going to do in here is just do a quick. I'll like to do it like a quick. I use Lighthouse to do a quick report. I just have best practices accessibility check. So this is just a Chrome extension that I can do a quick automated scan just to see if any red flags come up.
And what
Oftentimes
are the
this is
sort of things that you get from some automated accessibility testing versus some of the things that it would not really pick up?
yeah, that's a great question. So so generally anything that is dealing with semantics in nature and actually code that can be scanned, you won't get a lot of feedback as far as nuance, right? Like, well, is that alt tag appropriate for that image? You won't have that as a flag, but you might have a flag that, hey, this image doesn't have an alt tag. And so anything that could be picked up, from a code standpoint. Also, color contrast is one that it can pick up and determine. Sometimes it might not be accurate if there's any kind of positioning used from CSS that might place an object at absolute positioning. So in the DOM, seems like it's over some element, but it's really positioned when rendered over another. You might get kind of a false positive on that. But generally, it's those kind of things. It is a good check for buttons and color and stuff right away. I just like it as kind of a gut check. As a general rule that I've followed, give or take 20% of tests can be automated for accessibility, but the other 80% is either manually validated or fully manual. And so because of that, I don't rely on any kind of automated test, but I do find that it can help uncover a few things faster that might not discover. You can see here that it has a few errors. Buttons not having an accessible name and a few other things. These, as I look through these are actually related to the Storybook UI and not the actual component. And so there's nothing in here actually relevant to the component itself. So I'm just going to jump out of that and not worry about any of those scans. Like I said, this is a relatively simple component, so that is helpful as well. So far, there's no issues. The behavior seems okay. It's good. Another step might be, or not might be, another step would be to just like, let's look at the behavior of this without JavaScript and styles. And so if I come up here, I'm going to disable styles. We'll see a few things that we call out. I'm going to disable JavaScript. So initially, I would read this as, okay, there's something going on here, right? We see that it appears that there's a button, and then the text below, which we know from looking at this elsewhere. Oh, but I guess that's disabled everywhere. So we know that from looking at it elsewhere, this is the content that's hidden within that accordion. So one thing that's a plus right now is that this content is actually visible at this point in time. However, it's pretty quick to see that there's no structure here, and the meaning of this content, or what it's actually tied to, is completely lost. And so there's no hierarchy, there's no correct semantics that would help you understand what's going on. Do you have any questions, or is that pretty clear?
Clear so far.
Okay, and based on what we looked at in the authoring practices, right, where let's see here for this. Fortunately, this still works, right? We see here that the title is contained within a role button. We see that the button is wrapped in a heading, and if we look over here, we can clearly see that there are no headings here, and there's nothing containing that button. So we're already lacking in that structure. So what I like to do is, I'll jump over. I use Bear for note taking, so as a problem. I'll just say that um, I like to just jump in and capture the problems as I go. But I'll just note that without JavaScript, CSS, content has no meaningful hierarchy. And so you can pretty easily see that even though item 1 is listed here, this is just now independent. It's a button. Okay, here's a button, here's a line of text, here's a button, here's a line of text. There's no relationship between those, there's no hierarchy. And so that's a problem. So I'm going to turn back on JavaScript and the styles and take a closer look at what is actually happening here. So I'll open up my inspector. I'll jump in here and take a look at this element. Just gonna move some zoom controls quick. All right. So here, if we see, I'm gonna just jump out to the container even. The first thing that jumps out to me is this role of tab list. Now, nothing to this point that we've covered mentions anything about these being tabs, right? And indeed, tabs is a functionality, and we could actually go over here and see in the authoring practices, there is something for tabs. So that's a completely different component. But if we're looking at accordions, there's no mention of parity with tabs. And so I'm going to flag this as something where role equals tab list should be used on the parent container. Because already that might be inferring something to a different screen reader that is problematic, right? It's like this is maybe it's communicated as, hey, this is a set of tabs, but really it's not. It's an actual accordion with different functionality. So and also different capabilities as far as how you might traverse it. Tabs, for example, arrowing from tab to tab is something that is, if I believe, I'll just jump over the spec. I believe that is under the keyboarding. Let's just see. Yeah, so left arrow, right arrow for tabs is a requirement, right? It's not optional. And so there's different behaviors that are associated with these components. So it's important to have the semantics communicate that. And so having the role tab
So
is
something
going
just
to be
as
problematic.
simple, something just as simple as some naming conventions that someone put down when they were making an OMR here can have significant impacts on the experience of these accessible components.
Correct. And in a minute, I'll open up VoiceOver and we'll see if this does indeed have any impact. But it's something worth noting, and it's something that shouldn't be there just because this is not a tab list. And I do believe, and I'll just jump back over into this one more time here. If I'm looking at tabs, let's look at, let's see here. Okay, so if we look at tabs here, the first item, the element that serves as the container for the set of tabs has role tab list. So we can see right here, this is relegated to tabs. We don't have anything like that for accordion. And so because of that, accordion is saying, okay, I've got a one-to-one relationship between the accordion header and the accordion panel. There's not this extra container level relationship to define a set of accordion, expanding collapse elements, if you will. So that could be removed. So we'll jump into this here. Now we have an extra div that is an accordion item. Again, this is probably not necessary and a bit verbose. This could be added just for styling purposes, and I'm not gonna get too into that right now, but it does indeed look like there's some styling there. However, if we were using headings and other attributes, or if the expansion reveals a paragraph, those should also have their own CSS that would effectively get us to the same level of padding margin, whatever we might want to do style wise. So that might be something to look at that's as unnecessary. So as I jump down to the next level, I'm curious, Nick, based on what we've looked at so far, does anything stand out about this button to you? And let me know if you need me to zoom in or anything here.
So first thing that jumps out is role is tab equals tab. So that looks a little bit out of place to me. Type button, that seems about right. Class looks slightly verbose, but I'm not sure of the impact on that. But the thing that stands out most to me is the role equals tab.
Yeah, that's a good call. And so that is correct. Right away, we're losing button semantics by assigning it a different role. And with that, that's going to be a problem because it's not a tab. It's still a button, and semantically we want it to be communicated as a button. We want to have all of the affordance or capabilities that come along with the button. I'll be honest, just right away, I don't know if type equals button has any negative impact or fights a bit with role equals tab. My assumption is that it does. If this was just purely a button as it should be, we wouldn't need role equals tab or type equals button. So in that case, both of those attributes should be removed. And you're correct in calling that out. Another item that stands out, if we look at the spec, it mentions that each accordion, or the authoring guidelines, sorry, each accordion header button is wrapped in an element with the role of heading. And that can either be an actual H1, H2, however that shapes out. But we can clearly see here that this button is not wrapped in anything. And that's why when we turned off JavaScript and CSS, there's no hierarchy there. It's just a giant button and the text. So we're losing that type of relationship. So that's something I'm going to flag, that the button is not contained within a heading element. So that's definitely a problem. We'll list that the button has equals, and I'll clean up my notes later with formatting. And all right, so the button has role equals tab and type equals button, which is not necessary for what we're expecting for correct semantics. All right, so those items themselves are going to be helpful in fixing this. And we do see there is ARIA controls, and that was mentioned that we can have that. It has accordion item 2. So let's see here. Let's look. Okay, here's accordion item 2. I'm just going to expand this to see. All right, so accordion item 2. I find the naming a bit confusing just because it's the first item, but it's accordion item 2. So I won't get into that. The matter is that it actually does control this, and this reference here in ARIA Controls, accordion item 2, that points to the ID. It should be a unique ID of that div. And we can see that does that. We can see now ARIA expanded equals true. If I collapse this, ARIA expanded is false. So that's correct. That is changing and appropriate. If I come down and I look at this icon here, I'll notice that it also has ARIA hidden equals true. And that's appropriate because that's just a visual indicator. If that had any kind of text or something, it would also be announced in that button, and that would be unnecessary. So having that ARIA hidden is good, and we do have the label for that button itself. Again, there's probably a lot of extra elements in here that don't need to be, but for now we won't get too much into that and focus more on the accessibility side of it. As you called out button role tab, I notice the div for the content has role equals tab panel. And so again, somebody has built this in a way where they're trying to mimic the functionality of tabs and use these, but this is not a tab. And it's not a tab panel, it's not a tab set. So I'm going to note that the content panel shouldn't have role equals tab panel. So that's something else that stands out. All right. So the others are marked up the same. And so we can kind of take a look at this in isolation. So far, yeah, I'm just going to take a step back. I'm going to jump back over here. Obviously, I'm building out some things to identify in here. I know that, okay, the semantics are not correct. I know it's not following all the practices for an accordion. Space and enter keys, they do trigger the accordion, so that's correct. There's a communication of states that we'll test here more in a second with VoiceOver. Focus order is moving from, here it says from header to header, except we know that there's just button to button. Right now that focus order is still intact, although the underlying semantics aren't correct. Our visual design and affordance is in alignment. We see a change in states. We see the link and the hover, it has the style necessary. Ensure parity in experience between sighted and non-sighted users. Let's just double check that quick. With this hidden, we can indeed see we have display none, so that will not be visible to screen reader users or to anyone. And if or to sighted users, and so if I expand that, we can now see that is visible here, and the display is available. So we know that there is parity in the experience there, so that's good. All right, so now I'm going to just jump into VoiceOver, and hopefully you can hear it. If not, the panel should be visible. But when I start it, you'll hear it start to speak items, and I'll work through and focus on a few of those and move through it, let you listen to it, and then turn it off and come back to kind of close that out.
VoiceOver on Safari, Storybook window, toolbar has keyboard focus. You are currently on a toolbar. To interact with the items on this toolbar, Storybook, web content. Item 1, collapsed tab. You are currently on a tab inside of web. Item 1, expanded tab. Item 2, collapsed tab. You are item 2, expanded tab. Item 2, collapsed tab. Item 3, collapsed. Item 3, expanded tab. You are currently on a tab. Item 2, collapsed tab. Item 1, expanded tab. Item 1, collapsed tab. You are currently on item 2, item 3, expanded tab. You are currently on item 3, collapsed tab. VoiceOver off.
All right, so clearly it's being communicated as a tab and a tab set, and or I shouldn't say tab set, but it's each item here is communicated as a tab, and we can see that that's problematic. And by comparison, if I go back over to the authoring practices, the Accordion does have an example. Let's just see how this reads with VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Safari, Accordion example, vertical example. You are currently on personal information, dim expanded button. You are currently on heading level 3. Name, required edit text with autofill menu, personal information, email, extension, country, city / billing address, collapsed button, main, billing address, dim expanded button. You are currently on heading level 3. Address 1, edit text, billing address, dim expanded button, main. You are currently on heading level 3. Address 1, address, state, zip code, shipping address, collapsed button, main, shipping address, dim expanded button. You are currently on heading level 3. Billing address, collapsed, personal information, collapsed button, personal information, dim expanded button. You are currently on heading level 3. VoiceOver off.
So you can see the difference in the semantics, how this is announced as a button and a heading. And so with that, it's not going to say accordion, expanded, collapse. It just indicates that you're on a button that is collapsed, and or the referring content is collapsed, and you can interact with that button to expand and collapse it. When we're talking about tabs, the difference there is that typically when you're on a tab and when you traverse tabs, that content is made visible immediately. And you don't have to go to the tab, activate the tab, and then view the content. It's kind of one and the same. And this is a little bit different is in that you can go to the accordion item and then choose to expand and collapse it, where you're not going to expand and collapse tabs by clicking on that same item. So a little bit different there. If I were to disable styles here, we can see that let's see here, they do have the button within the heading. They do have the billing address, the shipping address, etc. So this one's a bit interesting just because the button is the text for the heading. So that to me is still, like, visually, I wouldn't get it. If I was looking at the DOM, I would get it, but that's something that I might look into further just to kind of investigate if this should appear as a heading, if it's not, collapsed or expanded. And I bet if I turn off JavaScript, I would expect that other content to be visible. So that's kind of interesting too, that this content is still hidden under either of those. I would actually want those to be expanded as well. So, all right. So we've kind of gone through a few demos and a few issues. I will make a note that VoiceOver communicates these as tabs.
So let's say we do the other aspects that are required of this audit right now. What are the sort of next steps that are required to start addressing these things?
Yeah, good question. And I think that's a good segue. I know we're just about at time. So what I would do is I would fill out this issue, first of all, with the problem. And if I didn't know the solution, I'd do some investigation around that to come up with the solution, link to resources, and then I'd create a related MR to fix those. And so that would be what my next steps would be. I would take any of these and notes that I've made and maybe build them out a little more. Let's see here. I want to say that I'll pull up a previous example really quick here. Badges is one that was done recently. In a recording of the audit, there'll be some things captured, but you can see there's a problem, solutions. There aren't any MRs opened yet for this, but that's what I would expect is kind of how we'd approach it. So you can see how in here I've listed for each problem, there's a solution. So that would be how I would approach it from next steps. I'd also probably do some deeper testing with potentially VoiceOver on iOS or NVDA and Firefox on Windows, like I mentioned. But I know right away there's a number of things that definitely need fixed across the board just to get this correct. So testing in some of those things right now is probably not going to be a great benefit until I really actually get it in a place that I know it's in alignment with the authoring practices. So I would seek to do that first and then do a follow-up audit or come back to this audit with a report and not close this out until those things have been completed and then maybe another test has been performed.
Right. So it seems like there's a lot of potential boxes that you could tick in order to make sure this is completely covered. How do you balance this with the MVC and just iteration in general?
That's a good question. I view accessibility as part of MVC in the sense that it should be accessible just by default, right? That should be something that we bake into every level of MVC. If we're starting with correct semantics, in a way I develop or in work is I'll start with an outline and I'll start with writing semantic markup before I add any styles or structure outside of that. And if we think of that as an MVC, like minimally viable for this is having a heading with the content, and then we start to layer in the next, what's the next, minimally viable change? Would it be adding the functionality and ARIA? So I view the underlying semantics as part of the MVC for it. But given that it's in this current state, I would say that MVC would be going in and just opening MRs to address a few of these changes. And some of them might have to be larger than not. And depending on how the components used in the product, can it easily be migrated? Are there Haml and Ruby templates that have to be updated and patterns? Those types of things would all have to be gone through. And so from there, that would help inform what might be, the minimal viable change that would maybe not have as many downstream impacts. It might be, there might be a need to even branch this off and to create another variation and work on it in isolation before migrating it in. But I hope does that answer that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so just to close this out, I know we're at time. Do you have any, for future audits, do you have any recommendations or feedback on how this would be more valuable or more beneficial to you?
So I think I'm not the most skilled when it comes to just semantics. I know some rudimentary HTML and so on. So I think having an understanding or just a reading list of things that I should know going into this, just for additional context, would be useful for people like me who don't code so much. I think having an understanding of this is at the component level, but having an understanding of what we need to take into account when designing features would be useful, and whether it's checks that we do on the components to ensure that they're sort of accessible, or how we lay out the page with the components, whatever it may be, that would also be useful.
Great.
And then also understanding what's the best way to collaborate with the engineers in my team around these sorts of things as well.
Mm-hmm. That's all good. I'm just taking some notes here. Yeah, I think that's all helpful feedback as a takeaway.
Great. Yeah, really appreciate you taking me through this.
Yeah. I hope it's helpful. And as you can see, to answer, will it pass? I would say no. So we have some work to do. So I guess without further ado, we'll hop off and start to get to work on this.